Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Alannah Brett. I'm co-hosting with Aaron today, and I'm very happy to welcome Dina Klimentieva, who's our speaker today. So I'll just give a quick introduction to Dina. So Dina has experience in both the business and the geology worlds. And on the business side, Dina initially worked as a project manager with international companies entering the Russian market. Following her business and also industry experience, Dina then moved over to the academic world and into the ETH Zürich in Switzerland. There she completed her master's in geology and is about to hand in her PhD, supervised by Christoph Heinrich, Thomas Dresner, and Albert von Quat. And during her PhD, Dina focused on mass balance and fluid processes of massive sulfide ore formation in porphyry copper and epithermal system at the Bor deposit in Serbia. This is the very interesting topic that Dina will be sharing with us today. So Dina is just about to hand in her PhD, and she's currently looking for the next opportunity in exploration geology. So she's excited to connect with anyone in the exploration geology and data science field, especially with opportunities to use her skills in the future. So thanks very much, Dina, for joining us, and we're really looking forward to your talk, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Alannah, and thank you for this invitation. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to people and discuss the geology of the massive sulfides at Bor. So today we'll be talking about the special feature of the Bor porphyry copper epithermal system with a few analogous systems around the world. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll start with a bit of regional geology context and then discuss the alteration and mineralization styles at Bor, focus on the massive sulfide assemblages and textures, and present petrographic evidence to support the hypothesis that replacement was indeed the key mechanism to form the massive sulfide ore at Bor. The rest of the presentation will be all things open for discussion and questions, our tentative fluid story. A lot of this talk will go hand in hand with what our collaborators in Serbia have seen at the Microscopic deposit, which is located close to Bor and relatively recently discovered. And also, we'll compare the textures we see at Bor to the mineralization at Onto, based on the recent economic geology paper published by David Burrows and co-authors. I will conclude with the bonus part of this presentation and talk about whether Zircon geochemistry can be used as an exploration tool and discuss the results of application of machine learning algorithms to the Zircon geochemistry. So let's start. We are in the Serbian segment of Apuzeni Banat Timok Srednogorje belt, which is a major metallogenic belt stretching from Romania in the north through Serbia to Bulgaria in the south. It's a late Cretaceous magmatic arc that formed as a result of the closure of the Vardar Ocean, and the magmatic ages across the arc, which was initially oriented east to west, but was deformed and followed post-collisional deformation. They get younger towards the west in Serbia and to the south in Bulgaria, which is interpreted to be a result of the progressive slab rollback. The Timok magmatic complex that hosts the Bor deposit is a prominent feature, and the magmatic stages within the Timok magmatic complex are subdivided into three main phases. So phase 1 andesite, which also is known as timosite, is considered to be the initial stage within the Timok magmatic complex, and prevalently displays hornblende and plagioclase phenocrysts with subordinate biotite and magnetite. The rocks of phase 1 andesite outcrop close to Bor and Veliki Kriveli deposits, and also to the south of Chikaropeki. Phase 2 andesites, with the main difference of the phenocryst component being the pyroxene and hornblende being the subordinate component, occupy most of the area of the map presented here. The Bor deposit is hosted by phase 1 andesite and truncated by the Bor fault, with bore conglomerates outcropping to the west of bore and also at the deeper levels of the bore mine. So here we look at the cross-section through the bore deposit. It exhibits the perfect continuum between the deep porphyry-style mineralization of Borska Reka, a transition between the porphyry mineralization hosted in stockwork veins to the epithermal mineralization at the shallow epithermal Tilva ore body. And the prominent feature of bore, which is also seen at Chukaropeki and Onto, are the massive sulfide ore bodies. Very high grade showed here in red. They are sort of rimming the deep porphyry zone and are located symmetrically. Our study focused on the remaining core from the T ore body, but the shallow massive sulfide Tilva ore body was extremely important for the economic significance of the bore deposit. Actually, when bore deposit was initially discovered, it was classified as the volcanogenic massive sulfide deposit, and only later, deeper drilling revealed the porphyry zone. Historically, the cross-sections through bore deposit have shown porphyries at the deeper level that were tilted, and there are only a few historic drill holes that intersect the deeper zone. We don't really believe that the deep porphyry, the causative intrusions are tilted. We think that judging from the mineralization contours and also from the zonation of the massive sulfides relative to the deep porphyry zone, the presence of several massive sulfides at the same level, we think that probably deep causative intrusions were not tilted, and we would be very glad to hear the opinion of the exploration geologists from bore, because we know that there is a lot of new drilling in the area. Also a lot of exploration going on around the bore and Veliki Kriveli mines. So hopefully there will be some new exciting results from the area. Let's focus a bit on the texture details of the porphyry, epithermal and massive sulfide mineralization at bore. The initial stages, A and AB veins, are similar to other porphyry systems in the world. A veins are curvy, sinuous quartz veins with very little mineralization and maybe only a late covellite overprint that's present through the rock matrix and also a bit in the veins. These are followed by magnetite chalcopyrite veins, where chalcopyrite contains bornite inclusions, so also very typical of porphyry association, hosted by the chloride sericite altered rock. As we go shallow, we see that A veins are cross-cut by magnetite veins and B veins that are in turn cross-cut by tiny hairline chalcopyrite pyrite veins in variably silicified chloride sericite and advanced argillic alteration zones. The signature feature of bore is spectacular bladed covellite and hydrite epithermal veins. And this atypical association goes to the extreme in its expression of massive sulfides. The above mentioned T, also historic Tilva Roche, T1, T2, there are many of those small lens-like massive sulfide ore bodies around here. So the key message from our paper published in Mineralium Deposita at the end of 2020 is that replacement is the mechanism that created this massive sulfide mineralization. This hypothesis was already suggested by Richard Silito in 1980, and we present somewhat textural and mathematical foundation to justify and prove this hypothesis. But first we have to figure out what stage of mineralization is represented by massive sulfides. From the relict quartz veins that are broken up and overgrown by chalcocite and covellite, also from the reopened, maybe AB veins that are overgrown by energite, covellite, chalcocite, but looked like they were initially A or AB type veins, we conclude that massive sulfide is the final stage of mineralization at the bore deposit. Let's look at the microscopic textures. So the key idea is that we start with the andesite protolith, where we see relict igneous texture, and proceed all the way towards the massive sulfide high-grade ore. This is how the initial texture looks like. And the next two samples are breccias that are seen at the bottom of the T ore body. And they contain clasts of variably altered andesite, clasts of pervasively silicified material, and also relicts of B vein that display the crystalline texture. As we go towards the center of the ore body, we see progressive enrichment of copper and iron and sulfur, and also zones of vaggy quartz, where all the igneous phenocrysts are leached out, and we are left with vugs, also with some replacement textures where we see that probably the amphiboles were converted to pyrite and rutile. The last two samples are massive sulfide samples, and they look somewhat similar at the hand sample scale. But if we focus on details, we see that some massive sulfides are more massive than the others. In this sample that comes from the lower part of the high-grade zone, we still see a lot of residual quartz. But this is the highest grade sample, where as little as 3% quartz with some rutile clusters are left, and everything else is turned into the massive covellite chalcocite mineralizations. So how do we figure out it really is replacement? We look at some relic textures and try to see whether we see some igneous phenocrysts converted to sulfides. And with a bit of imagination, we can discern the shape of the igneous amphiboles and see the relict cleavage at the proper angle and the outlines of the amphibole phenocrysts. And the bottom sample is a spectacular example of former igneous magnetite turned to pyrite plus rutile. We still see the parting planes of magnetite, again at the proper angle, and we see rutile precipitating along these former parting planes and also as rims on the phenocryst, on the former magnetite phenocryst. So here we come to one of the key standing points for our mass balance calculations. We need to find an element that stays immobile through the whole alteration mineralization process. And our best candidate for this is titanium, because whenever we see the alteration of magnetite to pyrite, we see that the titanium that was probably present in igneous magnetite still hangs around as rutile rims, as rutile precipitated along the parting planes of magnetite. Some more microscopic textures coming from the protolith, where we still see the interference colors of the igneous amphiboles, and twinning and zonation in the plagioclase, also unaltered plagioclase laths in the matrix. As the alteration progresses, it gets much more difficult to discern the initial shape of the phenocrysts, but rutile abundance and its textural position in the matrix remains the same. There's just as much rutile visually in this heavily altered sample as in the weakly altered sample. And to the right, we see the texture of epithermal veins, where covellite laths overgrow pyrite that's broken up and deformed and rounded. With the help of etching, we revealed internal texture of pyrite and see that there are at least 2 generations of pyrite. The core, that's probably full of inclusions, resembles a bit the spongy pyrite that David Burrows described in his economic geology paper that they have seen at Onto. And the rim is sort of inclusion-free. It overgrows the stage 1 pyrite. We see gold present in association with chalcocite and digenite in the massive sulfide sample, but generally zonation of the inclusions in pyrite and also the sulfide association from the porphyry to epithermal to massive sulfide stage could be described as chalcopyrite plus bornite to digenite and chalcocite and to covellite. Here's another key texture that allows us to state that replacement is the key mechanism for forming the massive sulfide ore. We see the residual quartz vein that's sort of eaten away by sulfides. So let's try to compare side by side the vein texture at the three deposits that are characteristic for this atypical pyrite-covellite association. To the left, we see a sample from Tilvaroche ore body that displays the covellite pyrite vein cross-cutting the quartz vein. In the middle, there is pyrite-covellite vein from Čukaropeki deposit, described by Miloš Veležić and his co-authors. It displays also prominent anhydrite kaolinite halo and some solid sulfur in the matrix. So extreme high sulfidation assemblage. And when we look at the veins shown by the David Burrows and co-authors, we see that those textures are quite similar. Spectacular massive sulfides that are present in Bor, where we here show these historic samples from 1977 from the upper part high sulfidation zone with the massive sulfide Tilvaroche ore body. Same association, covellite pyrite, massive sulfide, almost no residual quartz left in those samples. In the middle, there is massive sulfide from Čukaropeki, the famous sample from reservoir minerals presentation, and a sample of Miloš Veležić, where we see pyrite, covellite, and enargite. At Onto, to the right, the picture from the economic geology paper by David Burrows, the progressive change of patchy quartz allanite alteration and progressive infill of sulfides may be suggesting that the allanite is leached out, quartz matrix remains in place, and sulfides fill up the remaining space. The mass balance story of the massive sulfide is quite complex. Here we present 4 samples: Weige residual quartz, advanced agilic alteration sample, and 2 massive sulfide samples, one with quite a bit of residual quartz and the other with almost no quartz left. We plotted all elements, normalized them to the sum of squares, rescaled to the concentration of the protolith, and normalized them in the way that the sum of squares is always equal to 1, so they will all plot on the circle. The 2 key points for our hypothesis: first, that titanium is immobile, hence this black line connects the origin to the titanium, and everything that's above this line will be seen as enriched, and everything below this line will be seen as depleted. We also use the isovolumetric line, the red line, that represents the 1/over density ratios of the altered sample and the protolith. And the fact that we see very close coincidence between the reference titanium line and the isovolumetric line allows us to say that this replacement process was more or less volume conservative. The only sample where those 2 lines deviate a lot is the massive sulfide with residual quartz. Also, when we look at the truly massive sulfide, we see that minor volume loss is possible. The mass balance calculations are published as an appendix to our Mineralium Deposita paper. So if you feel like discussing this in more detail, please drop me a line. I will be happy to look at this relatively simple Excel spreadsheet together with you. And now we try to describe the fluid inclusions that we have seen at Bor. It's not easy. If you will look at the scale bar, you will probably feel my pain. And in the absence of good assemblages and primary, secondary, cross-cutting assemblages, we are left with trying to figure out what types of inclusions are mainly present in the core, mainly present in the rim, what kind of CL texture is associated with the different types of inclusions. And our fluid story, so we go from the early A veins, where we observe inclusions that look like typical primary porphyry inclusions. Also a lot of brines, probably coexisting with vapor. But a key feature is presence of salt melt inclusions coexisting with vapor. There is some residual quartz in the epithermal veins, where we see basically the same sequence. And in the rims of quartz that are often dull in CL, we see those irregular shaped aqueous inclusions with a tiny vapor bubble. And when we try to compare the inclusions in quartz and inclusions in the sulfides with a bit of near-infrared petrography, we see that the story repeats itself. The irregularly shaped aqueous inclusions are present in the rim, liquid vapor inclusions are present in the core, and the pyrite it's very difficult to see the phase proportions in pyrite, but we see that, yes, there are also same aqueous inclusions in the rim and lots of vapor inclusions in the core. Similar inclusions are present in the anhydrite from the epithermal veins. So when we try to compare the fluid story that we could figure out at Bor to Cukaropeki and to the recent results published for Onto, we see a striking resemblance between Bor and Onto, namely the presence of salt melts coexisting with vapor. There are some pressure temperature estimations. Boiling has been shown to be super important for Cukaropeki porphyry style ore, but more research is needed to conclude what makes the massive sulfides. Let's summarize the key points between and features of Bor, Cukaropeki, and Onto side by side. At Onto, the importance of pre-existing high-grade copper and gold mineralization has been shown, and probably some redistribution of arsenic. At Bor, we see overprint of early A and AB type veins within the massive sulfide, but we're not sure whether this type of early mineralization contributed to the creation of high-grade massive sulfide, purely from mass balance considerations. Unlike Onto, we see that at Bor and Cukaropeki, energite is coexisting with covellite inside the massive sulfide high-grade assemblage. We don't really see zonation between pyrite covellite and pyrite energite association. Also very interesting key features is anhydrite versus allanite at Bor, Cukaropeki, and Onto. There is allanite at Bor described in the literature, but we saw only very little of it, mainly as vag infill in the massive sulfide assemblage. Our mineral of choice is anhydrite. It's present everywhere as a very important constituent of the alteration assemblage inside the epithermal veins, pretty much everywhere. At Cukaropeki, allanite and anhydrite are both important. At Onto, allanite has been described as the major component and anhydrite only as a minor component. So what is actually the necessary and sufficient condition for creating this atypical covellite pyrite mineralization and the massive sulfides? If we think that the replacement process is the key, it's kind of clear that we can proceed from the protolith to the vaggy quartz stage. But how do you actually get rid of all the quartz that's left? And we think that probably condensation of vapor into seawater or meteoric water horizon could drive this quartz dissolution. One option is retrograde quartz dissolution, but it's probably not an option in our case because we would have to stay inside that perfect retrograde PT conditions for quite a long time. At ONTO, David and Burroughs and co-authors have suggested that cooling of magmatic vapor and accumulation below the sediment and andesite could lead to replacement of low sulfidation assemblage by high sulfidation assemblage, but it's unclear whether dissolution of quartz could also be the key component leading to the formation of the massive sulfide mineralization at ONTO. And for the last several minutes, I will present a bonus part of the presentation, which is divergent a bit from the main topic, but just show how we can use the Zircon geochemistry as an exploration tool. And I will build on the Zircon geochemistry data collected during my PhD project and also the previous PhD projects of Melanie Kolb and Daniel Gallhofer at the ETH Zürich. So how do we actually treat Zircon geochemistry data and understand whether we can separate zircons that come from the mineralized samples from the barren samples? First of all, we just collect the Zircon geochemistry data. Then we'll try to visualize all the chemical features and see if there is a good separation between these different sample groups. It also helps to spot and delete outliers, thinking back whether it can be an inclusion in zircon or whether it's just not a zircon grain at all. Following that, we split the data into the train and the test set and try different machine learning algorithms to see what predicts best, whether the zircon is coming from the mineralized area or barren area. And I'm open to discussion about everything concerning application of machine learning in geosciences, because there's a lot of talk about big data, good data, whether we really understand the limitations of the application of machine learning algorithms, and what we have to actually think about before we deploy the machine learning model. I will not be the first one to say that it works best in the well-explored region, and it's actually beneficial to look for the ore close to where you know that the ore exists. So when this is only a tiny bit of the data set that shows that separation between different sample groups is possible based on Zircon geochemistry. And to create a balanced data set, so we just a different way of visualizing the same chemical data and see if there are more outliers or if different groups can clearly be distinguished based on different chemical indicators. I'll go quickly over this. Here we plot correlation between different chemical elements and display the results of the prediction, telling apart barren samples from mineralized and from weakly mineralized samples. We tested different algorithms from logistic regression to decision trees, and we see that the accuracy on the test set is on the order of 70 to 90%, which means we can correctly predict whether the zircon comes from the mineralized area, weakly mineralized, or barren area based on its geochemistry. So to conclude, I would like to say a huge thank you to the Ore Deposits Hub for the invitation. It's been a pleasure giving this talk. A big thank you to the Mineral Resource Systems and Ore Fluid Group at the ETH Zürich. Thank you to our collaborators from the University of Belgrade and Sofia and RTB Bor for the access to the drill core and support during the fieldwork. Again, thanks a lot, the wonderful online platforms that help to connect to people during the isolation time. It's been great to get to know you all. People at GeoHug, thank you so much. Also, I'm a big believer in sharing the data and the knowledge. So I applaud the initiatives of open competitions that let people look at the data sets and try their hand at different tasks. Namely, thank you so much EIT Raw Materials and PDAC and Unearth and Oz Minerals. Also, big thank you to the ComniChain team, and please feel free to connect, to send me an email to discuss the massive sulfides or machine learning or Zircon geochemistry, feel free to connect on LinkedIn. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you everyone again for coming. Over to you, Alannah.
Thanks so much, Dina. Thanks. There was a really interesting talk and amazing pictures. I really love to see all that detail there. And also such an interesting story to kind of get us into how those extremely enriched massive sulfide bodies form. And with that, I'll just pass it over to Aaron briefly, because we potentially have a guest panelist that might have joined us today.
Yeah, thanks, Alannah, and thanks so much, Dina, for the great talk on the porphyry epithermal system. I think, I mean, having had a lot of opportunities to see rocks from your samples, I don't think there's a lot of systems in the world that are as spectacular as this. And actually, to talk to somebody who knows a lot about the other systems of the world, we'd like to ask Dick Silito if he would like to unmute himself and maybe join the discussion here. Dick is world-renowned researcher in porphyry and epithermal systems, from alteration to the mineralization itself. And I think his experience and insight on this can be really valuable. So I'm asking him to unmute if he would like to join. Hi, Dick, how are you?
Yeah, good morning, Aaron. Thank you for the introduction there.
Good morning.
Yeah, very, very nice talk. Enjoyed it, especially the pictures. Really good. One thing that occurred to me actually while I was listening and watching is that there are many different bodies, as you alluded to there, in bore of massive sulfides, apparently just scattered around when you see them plotted on cross sections. I appreciate, you know, most of that stuff's mined out now, so you've not been able to see it. But any feelings for what controls the location of all those little scattered bodies? I mean, if someone's exploring for them, that's quite an important point.
Yeah, thank you for this question. And actually, I was hoping that I would be able to ask the same question to you, but I think it's a lateral fluid flow that controls the location of those massive sulfide ore bodies, and we see continuum between the porphyry and epithermal style mineralization, sometimes over a break in other systems, but here it really looks like the fluid was flowing around and meeting the favorable spot for the deposition of the massive sulfide mineralization. It also goes down to permeability controls, of course. So maybe if I just imagine the volcanic edifice and the fluid discharge rimming around this volcanic edifice, that's probably the key. And well, yeah, asking the same question back to you. So if you were talking to a data scientist that would have to put the exploration logic down step by step, what would you formulate as the key to criteria to look for the systems with massive sulfides as opposed to without?
Wouldn't have the faintest idea, really. There is a point here. You know, back in I don't know when it was now, probably in the late Pliocene sometime, I got a chance to look around the Bore pit when it was in production. And some of those shallower bodies, like Tina Rolsch, they're above the porphyry type mineralization. The body you looked at was overprinted on porphyry type mineralization, but some of the shallower bodies apparently were not. They were above the porphyry type mineralization, which is the more typical position, I think, for massive sulfides in these lithocap environments. And like you say, I think you just got, it is permeability, but it's very difficult to define permeability, especially when it's been occluded by the generation of intense alteration and massive sulfide. But presumably it's some sort of interplay between stratigraphic or lithologic permeability and faults and fractures. But in those environments, not easy, I don't think, to be predictive.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you bring up, Dick, about and Dina as well, about lateral fluid flow, because in the system, unless you're having sort of like subhorizontal fractures or some other sort of fluid focusing mechanism, I don't know what the propensity for lateral or horizontal fluid flow would be to make the lenticular ore bodies.
Yeah, well, I think in most systems it probably doesn't. It just happens that that in Serbia and Bulgaria there are several examples, but viewed globally there are not all that many really, and a lot of this style of mineralization is much more dispersed, much more disseminated in style, and presumably that is a reflection of a lower degree of fluid focusing, I guess.
Yeah, and permeable versus impermeable horizons and the possibility to accumulate this highly reactive fluid is also important.
Yeah, yeah.
Great.
But they're not all quite such high sulfidation state though as Onto and Chukwuemeka and Bor. I mean, some of them, as you're well aware, are pyrite energite bodies, really.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I just want to say that this is an important place to start the discussion and keep going. And Dick, I'd invite you to feel free to join in the discussion as we move on, whenever, as our guest panelist for this. In terms of lateral extension of the system and lateral controls, I'd like to invite Tim Ireland to join and ask a question on this. You can unmute yourself, Tim. Or no, you can't. Maybe now you can.
Trying. Thanks, Aaron. Good day, everyone. Yeah, so the question I posted in the chat was whether the high sulfidation mineralization at Bor is associated with a laterally extensive advanced stage lithocap, as we see in, I guess, a lot of the other classical high sulfidation type systems. And if not, as I suspect is the case, why not?
Hi, Tim. Thanks for the question. It's good to see you.
Likewise.
Well, the upper zone in Bor is everything advanced agilic alteration. And well, maybe the key difference is the absence of allanite, which I think is present in Lepanto. We cannot really define the shape extent of this agilic alteration, so I probably would not name it a classic lithocap. But yeah, we see a lot of advanced agilic alteration associated with the epithermal veins, also surrounding the high-grade massive sulfide ore bodies. Also, a variable degree of silicification around the massive sulfide ore bodies. So I would say the alteration type is similar.
Yeah, the alteration type is similar. I'm nagging at the idea of the geometry of and extent of that alteration. So I guess when we're taught about high sulfidation systems as students of economic geology, we're often shown diagrams that show kilometers and kilometers of advanced agilic alteration that are an order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude more voluminous than the ore bodies themselves. Would that general idea still hold up at Bor, or are the alteration zones, I guess, relatively restricted, something on the order of hundreds of meters outside the ore bodies rather than kilometers?
We didn't see the full extent of the system, but what we saw is that it's sort of hundreds of meters away from the porphyry and epithermal zone. We see some vagi quartz, and vagi quartz has been reported on top of the system. So I guess the vagi quartz would be the key criteria to try to target the massive sulfides.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
I think I can just chip in there, Tim. I think one of the issues there is that you've got these younger, or at least unaltered volcanics over the top. So the full aerial extent is difficult to appreciate at surface.
Mm-hmm.
And quite often you drill in areas quite a long way from bore, say half a kilometer away from bore, and you penetrate advanced argillic alteration in depth below essentially fresh volcanics. So I think it's more of a visual effect than reality.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks for jumping in there again, Dick. So I maybe bring over a question from YouTube, which is basically asking Dina about, back to kind of looking at the protolith there and how that could control permeability. Can you envisage different layers somehow on the protolith, or maybe pyroclastic or ignimbrite somewhere? Is there something like that, or is it just entirely the andesite?
Yeah, I know that there are tuffs described there around bore and on the old cross sections of the bore deposit. We were not that lucky to see the tuffs. Mostly, we could convince ourselves that all we see within the massive sulfide is the same original andesite protolith, some breccias and variably altered clasts, and this serves as the key point that we stand on, that you can proceed from the silicate rock into the massive sulfide if you got the right fluid and the right conditions for this. But I know that tuffs and ignimbrites were described around bore.
Okay, thanks. Do you have another question there, Aaron?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Alannah, and thanks, Dina. We have a question asking to hypothesize. I can invite John Menzies to chat himself, or I can read his comment for him. So I give him 1 second.
Yeah, sure, I'm here. I think, yeah, that comment was made before Dick's erudite discussion of the issue, but I am intrigued by the fact that the distribution of these things in these systems is really unpredictable. And but invariably they're quite late stage in the overall alteration schema. I just wonder whether or not the preceding silicification alteration events haven't produced an essentially fairly large zone of impermeability, and with subsequent evolution of the fluid and increasing fluid pressures, whether even very minor and largely unpredictable discontinuities could result in, the necessary brecciation and permeability generated by that excess hydrostatic pressure.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we think that this replacement and removal of quartz, precipitation of sulfide process could be somewhat a runway process. So once it starts, it kind of self-perpetuating. And the key would be one of the hypotheses is you're lucky if you still have the seawater there, because the high pH of seawater contributes to the quartz dissolution. The question is whether the fluid system stays long enough in the same place to allow the bulk scale quartz dissolution and sulfide precipitation, or if it moves, then you don't have enough time to dissolve all the silica that's been precipitated by the earlier fluids.
Thanks, Dina. Then we can go on. We've got another great question here. So this one's from Annika Vastrom. Sorry if I mispronounced that. And she asks, is there any zoning in, for instance, tellurium or bismuth, or is there any other good vectoring elements?
We haven't looked in very great detail to the zoning patterns. I guess bismuth would be one of the key elements to check. And my favorite would be maybe arsenic, based on other analog systems. But I think we have Stuart Smith in the audience. He probably has a good answer to this question.
Without notice. No, I mean, I'm not familiar enough with the bore system and the other systems to comment on that. Sorry to let you down there, Dina.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Thanks, Stuart. Back to you, Aaron. I think you got another question there.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to say, or get back a little bit to this sort of the morphology of the ore bodies there, and a question from Doug Kerwin, if you want to invite yourself or unmute yourself. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Dina, great talk. Some of the rock types you showed earlier in the presentation look to be diatreme breccias, which are fairly common around these types of systems. I'm just wondering whether there might be any influence of the geometry of the diatreme breccias with respect to the distribution of the massive sulfide zones, perhaps around the margins or near the upper margins of some of the diatreme breccias.
Yeah, great question there. And I think breccias are my favorite rock types, basically. And they are really important to provide the permeability in fluid pathways. One thing is that it's sort of difficult to map those breccias and their extent with the limited access to drill core. And well, there are also cases when rocks were first defined as coherent rocks and then redefined as breccias during the relogging campaigns. So I think there is still some space for interpretation, and probably there are some diatreme breccias that we just didn't find or didn't have access to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm not experienced with diatreme textures and breccias, but Dina, how would you say you would go about identifying those? You've done a lot of textural work, clearly. So what would you be looking for that?
I would be looking at the geometry to make sure it's a diatreme. And for that, you need a really large extent of sampling and a good resolution of sampling.
Yeah, that's true. That's great. Dina, actually, I've got another question coming into my private chat. I think Florian Altenberger, you maybe already know. He said that you use the Perplex program a lot to calculate phase diagrams for ore minerals. And he asks, is it also applicable for epithermal deposits like you've studied in Bohr to reconstruct the pH conditions during mineralization?
Thank you so much for that one. Yeah, I'm a big fan of thermodynamics and kinetics as applied to the mineralization processes. Yes, we have used basically coordinates of sulfur and oxygen fugacity to model the sulfide assemblages at different temperatures and pinpoint the composition of the system in relation to the resulting ore assemblage that you get. And we could get the pyrite, covalite, chalcocite assemblage at relatively low temperatures. So we assume that, yes, it is applicable. And James Connolly from ETH Zürich has published a kind of holy grail paper where he allows equilibrating the rock and the fluid and seeing the fluid components at the same time. And we gave a try and saw that the sulfate complex is really important during the epithermal stage. And yeah, if you want to discuss that in more detail, we can maybe have a separate chat or drop me an email and I'll be happy to share the results.
And, just to cover again, what kind of temperatures do you see roughly for the different stages of the mineralization here?
So for the epithermal mineralization, the temperatures are quite low. It's 170, 150. And the historic fluid inclusion work shows that it can be as low as 120. So it really is low temperature, which is also in line with the interpretation of large amount of seawater mixing with the low amount of hot magmatic vapor.
Great, thanks, Dina. We've got another one here from John Mackenzie's. Would you like to unmute yourself again?
Yeah, what was the question? Yeah, I think one nice characteristic of diatreme breccias is to find vuggy silica clasts within the breccia itself. So I guess the question is, do you see vuggy silica mineralized or otherwise clasts in the Brexia diatreme rocks?
We do see vuggy silica quartz inside the breccias that we studied, but they are not really diatreme, like they are a couple of meters in the core. And yeah, there are vein clasts, vuggy silica clasts, and clasts of variably altered andesite protolith. It's just that we cannot really figure out the full extent of this breccia. It didn't look like a diatreme breccia to us, but just a like small couple of meters interval.
If you look through the Onto paper, there's a spectacular photograph there of an apparently unmineralized vuggy silica clast within one of the ontobrexias. So really spectacular. There was a second question there, if I might, and I guess it's not quite on topic, but is there sufficient age dating to estimate how long these massive sulfides may have taken to generate?
There are some age dates from molybdenite, but molybdenite comes from the deeper porphyry style mineralization, not from the massive sulfide. I guess with the advent of the dating techniques on sulfides that's being developed at the moment at the ETH by Nicolas Santillan and his collaborators, if we could date every sulfide, we could probably arrive at the age spans that allow the formation of the massive sulfide mineralization. So far, what we are left with is looking at the rate equations of quartz dissolution and trying to figure out how long does it take to dissolve quartz. And we did some basic calculations of that and concluded that within 1 year, if you got the right fluid composition and temperature, you can form the massive sulfide lens, or like you can dissolve enough quartz to make space for the massive sulfide lens of 50 to 70 meters. But that's not sulfide deposition, that's quartz dissolution.
That's in pretty stark contrast to, you know, other estimates for porphyry, copper and epithermal systems I've seen where, you know, the estimates are, you know, 100 or so tons of copper introduced to the system over the estimated period of formation.
Yes, and we can separate the magmatic side of it and the fluids process side of it, because we know that the magmatic systems are really long-lived and they are being replenished, and there are multiple porphyry phases that are sometimes separated, really separated in time. But when we look at the porphyry copper systems are huge systems, and the veins can be located pretty much anywhere. And if you have another vein pulse that crosscuts the old veins, that's okay. You're not really constrained to this small lens, which is the typical feature of the massive sulfide ore bodies.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Dina, for the answer. We're just starting to wrap up the discussion section here, but I want to bring everyone's attention that we've just posted the certificate link in the chat. So if you need proof that you were in the session here, you can go to the link there and fill in some information. Dina, if you've got time for just a couple more questions, we still have some left, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Great. Nasrullah actually has a question on the machine learning techniques that you've worked on in terms of the Zircon geochemistry. And she asks how those would be applicable in other parts like a Gaussian or other parts of the system. But I think maybe more broadly we can say, or we can make the question like, how can you apply this to other mineral systems? Because I think you mostly applied it with Zircon geochemistry. Yeah, and so how would it work in other parts of similar massive sulfide systems or porphyry epithermal systems?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's something I would very much like to do one day, to vector based on application of machine learning algorithms while the drilling happens. So with Zircon geochemistry, we've got quite a turnover time on the sample, and you cannot really do it real time. But if you have the assays along the drill hole, you can maybe collect the data as the drilling happens and get a really short feedback loop into the system and try to vector based on the key elements that are potentially useful for vectoring. And well, VMS is, you would have to see what Pathfinder elements are present, whether they work. And the beauty of it is that you can try to give feedback really quickly.
Yeah, what type of chemical analysis would you propose for systems like this, where you wanted relatively rapid feedback, like within a day or two days, maybe?
Yeah, so it would be a beautiful example if you can feed that data back into the algorithm, redefine the key groups of samples, and correct the mistakes that you have done in the process. So that's something I would very much like to do one day.
As well, that's really interesting. Yeah, that was kind of like a little bit of outlook there, Dina, already, but I wondered, do you have any next steps other than that you are interested to pursue, either around Bohr or something else?
Yeah, well, I believe there will be a lot of new exciting work done at Bohr, around Bohr. There are many companies exploring for new targets, and everything from skarns to massive sulfide and porphyry mineralization undercover. So if there are some local geologists in the audience, I would like to hear if there are any new results, including whether they have found deep porphyry zone or good magnetic contacts indicating the position or the orientation of the causative intrusions. Yeah, and if not, I'm open to discussion on the any questions related to the massive sulfide mineralization, application of machine learning algorithms and exploration. Yeah, and thanks again, everyone, for coming and for your questions.
Absolutely. Dina, if you could just put up your contact information so that any interested geologists could reach out to you one last time. And then I'd also like to invite Dick Stillito if he has any last comments on what you've said about the Bohr system here, whether it's formation or sort of the history of the mineralization that we've kind of got into a little bit today.
As long as you don't ask me to talk about machine learning, then I'll be very happy to come in with a final comment. It just occurred to me there, listening to the discussion, that perhaps a common feature of Chukwuemeka and Bohr and Onto is that all three were confined beneath an apparently impermeable horizon at the time of mineralization. And that would not be perhaps a typical attribute of most high sulfidation systems. So maybe that was a contributory factor in preventing fluid exit from the system, and perhaps facilitating the replacement process.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dick, and thanks very much, Dina. There's lots of thanks in the chat, and a huge thanks from us at Ore Deposits Hub. It's been so great to have you. Yeah, we have another interesting talk coming up this evening. That is, do you have that there, Aaron?
Yeah, so this evening at 17 in GMT or 5 p.m. GMT, we'll have Jose Piquet talking about a new model for optimal structural context in giant porphyry copper deposit formation. and he'll be talking about examples, particularly from the Andes. So if you're around this evening or wherever you are, it's maybe difficult in Australia, but we would love to have you there and see you this evening. Again, a big thanks to Dina Klimentieva and Dig Silito for joining us today. And as always, to my amazing co-host, Alannah Brett.
Thanks, Aaron.
Very great session.
And thanks everyone for joining. So we'll finish up there. Have a nice day.
Thanks to everybody.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Thanks, Dina.